Bristol Community College, Mathematics with Dan Avedikian, Math 131, Elements of College Mathematics, Section 4.1, Problem 10. This is Section 4.1, Problem 10. It says pivot the highlighted element. So you have a fairly large tableau, so you have columns x1, x2, x3, s1, s2, s3, z, and RHS for right-hand side. There are 4 rows in this tableau. The first one is 2, 2 again, 1, 1 again, 0, 0 again, another 0, and then 12. It's the top row. The second row is 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 0, 0 again, and then 45. Then the third row is 3, 1, 1 again, 0, 0 again, 1, 0, 20. And finally, the fourth row is -2, -1, -3, 0, 0 again, another 0, 1, and then the last value is 0. So, and it says pivot the highlighted element. The highlighted element is in the top row in the x3 column, it's a 1. So the top row of the x3 column is a 1. I drew it in green on the whiteboard so it stands out a little bit. So to pivot a tableau, what you need to do is turn the pivot element into a 1 and turn the rest of that column into zeros. It's like solving one column of a matrix. So now ordinarily there's a little bit of work to do to make the pivot element into a 1. We already have a 1, so we don't have to do any work. Ordinarily you have to do that row times 1 over something to make the pivot element a 1. In this case we don't have to. So we can get right into making zeros. So the pivot element is in the top row, so I don't want to change the top row. I want the top row to stay the same, and it will. So I can just keep the top row 2, 2 again, 1, 1 again, 0, another 0 after that, and then a 12. So that was the top row, and that's going to stay the top row. Now, the next row down in my pivot column, I have a 3. That 3 must become a 0. So I'm working in row 2. Next to row 2, I'm going to write an equation that's going to determine how I'm going to get my new row 2. And I'm going to write row 2 equals some stuff plus the old row 2. And that little equation starts with row 2 because the value I'm going to turn into a 0 is in row 2. It ends with row 2 because it should start and end with the same row. Now what I left in the middle as stuff is the row with the pivot element, which is row 1, times the same number but opposite sign of what's turning into a 0. It's a positive 3 that's turning into a 0, so it's going to be row 1 times -3. So the equation I'm going to use is row 2 equals -3 times row 1 plus the old row 2. That'll make my 0 where it needs to go, and it's going to change the other values in row 2. So the first position, I'm going to do -3 times row 1 is -3 times 2. That's -6. And I'm going to add that to row 2. So -6 plus 1. -6 plus 1 is -5. Next, I'm going to do -3 times row 1 is -3 times 2 again. It's another -6. But now when I do plus row 2, it's going to be -6 plus 2. So -6 plus 2 is -4. The next position, I'm going to do -3 row 1 plus row 2. So -3 times row 1 is -3 times 1, that's -3, plus row 2. So -3 plus +3 is what I'll get. -3 plus +3 is 0. The next position, -3 times row 1 is -3 times 1, which is a -3. And I'm going to add that to row 2. So I'm going to add -3 plus 0. -3 plus 0 is -3. And then next, I'm going to do -3 times row 1 is -3 times 0 plus row 2. So I'm going to do 0 plus 1, which is 1. Then next, -3 times row 1 is -3 times 0, which is 0, plus row 2. So that's 0 plus 0. 0 plus 0 is 0. Next, -3 times row 1 is -3 times 0 again, which is 0, plus 0 again for plus row 2. So 0 plus 0 is 0. And then finally in the very last column, -3 times row 1 is -3 times 12, which is -36. And I'm going to add that to row 2, so I'm going to add it to 45. -36 plus +45 is +9. So I've made one of my zeros. That finishes off row 2. So now I'm going to go into row 3. So in row 3, in the pivot column, I have a 1. So that 1 has to become a 0. So I'm working in row 3. So next to row 3, I'm going to make another little equation, which is going to say row 3 equals some stuff plus the old row 3. Now, I start that little equation with row 3 because that's the row I need to make the 0 in. I end it with row 3 because it has to begin and end with the same row. Now, what I left as stuff is the row with the pivot point, which is row 1 in this problem, times the same number opposite sign as what's becoming a 0. So what's becoming a 0 is a positive 1. So same number opposite sign as positive 1 is negative 1. So the equation I'm going to use for my new row 3 is row 3 equals negative 1 times row 1 plus row 3. And I'm going to do that to every position in row 3 and make a whole new row 3. So negative 1 times row 1 in the first column is negative 1 times 2. That's going to make a minus 2, and I'm going to add it to row 3. So I'm going to do minus 2 plus positive 3. Minus 2 and positive 3 combined for a positive 1. Next column, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 2, which is negative 2 again. But now when I add it to row 3, I add it to 1. So negative 2 and positive 1 is negative 1. Next, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 1, which is minus 1. I'm going to add that result to row 3, which I'm going to add it to 1. So minus 1 and positive 1 combine to make a 0. Next column, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 1, which is a negative 1. I'm going to add that result to row 3, so I'm going to add it to 0. So I'm going to add negative 1 plus 0, which gives me a negative 1. The next column, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 0, which is 0. I'm going to add that result to row 3, so I'm going to add it to another 0. So I'm going to do 0 plus 0, which is 0. The next column, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 0 again, which is 0. And now when I add it to row 3, I'm going to add that 0 to a positive 1. So 0 and positive 1 is 1. And then the next column, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 0. So it's another 0. I'm going to add that to row 3, so I'm going to add that to 0. I'm going to add 0 plus 0, which is 0. And finally, in the last column, negative 1 times row 1 is negative 1 times 12, which will be a negative 12. I'm going to add that to row 3, which is 20. So I'm going to add negative 12 and positive 20 is positive 8. So that takes care of my new row 3. I have to make a 0 show up in row 4 in the x3 column to finish my pivot. So I'm going to be working in row 4. So next to row 4, I'm going to write one of those little equations. It's going to be row 4 equals some stuff plus the old row 4. And again, I start that little equation with row 4 because that's the row that I'm making the 0 in. I end it with row 4 because it should begin and end with the same row. And what I left in the middle and just called stuff, again, is the row with the pivot position, where for this particular problem is row 1. And I'm going to multiply times the same number but opposite sign as what's becoming a 0. What's becoming a 0 is a negative 3. So same number opposite sign as negative 3 is positive 3. So the equation I'm going to use to make my new row 4 is row 4 equals positive 3 times row 1 plus row 4. And I'm going to apply that to every value in my old row 4. So first column, positive 3 times row 1 is 3 times 2, which is 6. Added to row 4, so I'm going to add 6 and negative 2. 6 and negative 2 is positive 4. The next column, 3 times row 1 is 3 times 2 again, which gives me another 6. And I'm going to add that 6 to row 4. This time I'm going to be adding 6 and negative 1. 6 and negative 1 is positive 5. Next, I'm going to do 3 times row 1 is going to give me 3 times 1, which is positive 3. I'm going to add that to row 4, so positive 3 and negative 3 is 0. Next, I'm going to do 3 times row 1 is 3 times 1, which is 3. I'm going to add that to row 4, 3 plus 0. 3 plus 0 is 3. Next, 3 times row 1 is 3 times 0. That gives me a 0. I'm going to add that to row 4, so I'm going to add it to another 0. I'm going to add 0 plus 0, which gives me 0. Same thing's going to happen in the next column. 3 times row 1 is 3 times 0, which is 0. I'm going to add that to row 4, which is plus another 0. So 0 plus 0, I have another 0. The next column, 3 times row 1 is 3 times 0 again. So that's another 0. But this time when I add that result to row 4, I add 0 plus 1, which is 1. And finally, in the very last column, 3 times row 1 is 3 times 12, which makes a 36. And then I add that to row 4, so I'm going to add 36 plus 0. 36 plus 0 is 36. So that completes the pivot. I had the 1 already. I made the rest of the column into zeros, and now it's been pivoted.